Hi, this is Julie Pettyjohn. The other day I was quilting and I noticed a couple of little holes in my quilt where I had not caught the seam properly, and I needed to take the quilt off, repair those, and put it back on. I decided to make a quick video kind of on the fly. It's a little wobbly, the audio's not the greatest, but I'm hoping that it helps if you ever have this happen to you. Hey, this is Julie. I just finished this quilt on my long arm. But earlier, I had a situation come up and I was thinking, gee, I wish I would have videoed this. But I want to tell you about what happened. I was about halfway down this quilt and I saw that, I think it was somewhere over in here, that the seam had not been caught. So sometimes, when I have two layers and I'm stitching along, the other layer, the bottom layer, is scooched over and doesn't get caught up in the stitch, right? So I had that resulted in a little hole in the quilt. And I also had one over here, which you can still see a few stitches where I tried to hand stitch that, so I need to take them out. But I knew that if I could get to those with my sewing machine, I could fix them real quickly and I could fix them well. But I just didn't want to take this off the long arm. So first I tried to hand stitch. I took the bottom part of my quilt, I released it, took the quilt top up and worked on the seam from there. I knew it wouldn't work because some of you may be real good at that, but when I try to hand stitch things like that, it looks like a Frankenstein job. So I finally decided, no, I just can't do this. I've got to take it off the long arm. I hate to take something off in the middle of a job, but here's what I did. I did take it off. I repaired those two things, put it back on, and I don't think anyone could possibly tell where I stopped and where I started with my quilting. So I want to tell you what I did. First of all, I had AM Hot Cocoa design on my Pro Stitcher. And so I lined it up. I had my pin in where the start was going to be, right? And you can see I made a mark with a blue water soluble pin, and the stick pin was in there, but I just took my pin and made a little dot over it. I use this blue Mark Be Gone marker, and then I looked at where the hooks were. Okay, so all across the quilt, I made a blue dot where this hook was and this hook and this hook, this hook and this hook, this one, and this one. Okay, and I'll explain to you why. So you can see where my blue dots were and where the stitching came later. It's a little off because they weren't matching up just right, but they're so close, right? Okay, they're so close that it's not going to matter to the eye. All right, so all across the quilt, I marked that. Now, here's the reason why I did that, because you might think, well, hey, you marked the beginning one, why do you need those all the way across the quilt? Because all you have to do when you get it back on is line that up and do modify, reposition on start point, and there you are. Well, the reason I did those dots is because this is not my first time to take a quilt off, and I have found that sometimes when you have to take a quilt off in the middle of the quilting and put it back on, that if you don't get it attached to your poles just real good and real straight, that the design will angle then. Okay, so what would have happened, mine was in pretty good shape, so I didn't angle at all. So that's what you hope will happen. You hope for the best, that you'll get it back on, get it lined up and say, hey, those dots on the quilt and my little hooks are lining up well enough. But if they're not, if you find out that, let's say you get the first one lined up, but these others are going downward, then you just modify and rotate. And you're going to rotate that whole design. And see, you just start turning the design, not that much, of course, but you turn it up so that your dots on your quilt all across are lining up. Now, it shouldn't be much of a rotate, but you may have to do that. Otherwise, if you don't, if your dots are not lining up and you don't rotate that design to line up on it, see, you've got your quilt on not in the same orientation, just a little bit off from where it was originally. And if you don't line them up, then you're going to have either like a big gap one place, or you're going to have like your stitches, let's say, the stitches you already had, if you needed to rotate it down, okay, like down like this, the way it is. If you needed to do that because your design is lining up like this, if you don't do that, this part's going to stitch into the stitches you already had, right? And if it's the other way around, if you get these lined up and you didn't line this part up, you're going to have a pretty big gap, a noticeable gap where there was no quilting. So that's why it's very important to get your get it as straight as possible back on. So when I took this off, I went over, I stitched up my seams, and then when I put it back on, and I use these purple snaps from the Red Snapper Company, and I could see where my indentation was with the fabric. All right, and I could see on this end, I could see the indentation that was still kind of in the backing fabric. So I tried to go by that as the best I could. I realized when I got back over here, I had not checked to see where I put the quilt from left to right. Some people always center their quilts, this little center mark, but you can see that I don't. And there's a reason I don't do that, because if you're putting your quilt in the same spot and using the same center over and over, your leaders can begin to stretch out of shape. So I like to move my quilt. If I have small quilts that don't need the whole long arm, I like to sometimes have them positioned more to the right and sometimes have them positioned more to the left. I just center the top onto the backing, but I don't worry about where it is on the long arm. So when I came back over to the quilt, I couldn't remember just where I had it on my measuring. It would have been a good idea to check my numbers over here and see where I had it. But I decided that wasn't the important part. If my quilt was, I'm going to move these crosshairs, excuse me. If my quilt started right in here where these orange crosshairs are, and my design is like this, all I have to do is, once I find the start point, and I do modify, reposition, and reposition it at my start point, which means at my crosshairs. Okay, and it moves over there. So I could get that part easy peasy wherever I had the quilt, way left, way right, or center or center-ish. So that part wasn't that important. So that was good. I got this very first one, you find that place, modify, reposition on start point. Then start moving your crosshairs over to a hook, okay? And then look down at your quilt, and of course I've moved this so it's not gonna line up, but you look down at your quilt and say, oh, is that where my dot was that I made before? And then go over here to this one, and then look down at your quilt and say, is that where I made my blue dot? And if it is, you're good. If it's not and you find it slanting, then you're going to have to go to the Modify Rotate and rotate your design slightly, one direction or another. I hope that helps you if you ever have to take a quilt off and put it back on. Thanks for watching.